Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos to this inaugural session of the Mexican Studies Seminar from the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curí. I'm the center's director. As you all know, we are hosting a series of talks this next month on the topic of Mexico and Trump, clearly of great interest, but also a rapidly evolving one. And we have the pleasure today of inaugurating this series with a presentation from Carlos Bravo Regidor, an old friend of this university and this center, and also a very distinguished political analyst, journalist, and public intellectual, writing in various media in Mexico, television, radio, and also newspapers. Carlos's unenviable task is to begin by giving us a global sense or a larger sense of this situation that is now capturing the interest of everyone in Mexico, in the United States, and beyond. As you know, the title of his talk is Mexico and Trump, a Panoramic View. For those of you who are new to this seminar, we will have a presentation for about 35 or 40 minutes. And after that, we will have time for questions and comments. And with that, it is really my pleasure to welcome back to the Katz Center, Carlos Bravo Regidor. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Emilio. Thank you very much for the invitation, for your kind presentation. It's a pleasure to be here. I have mixed feelings about not being in Chicago, of course. On the one hand, I love visiting. On the other hand, I know it's incredibly cold. So let's call it, a draw. And well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to be, talking a bit about, particularly Trump and Mexico, maybe with an emphasis on the Mexico side of the equation, and knowing that there are other people that are going to come after who are going to dwell more into the specifics of trade, the specifics of security, and the specifics of migration. So as the title of the talk suggests, I'm going to try to be a bit more panoramic in terms of the relationship with Mexico and in terms of how, in terms of the introduction to the discussion about Trump more generally. I think that the place to begin is perhaps the question of, is the US a superpower in decadence or not? There are certain areas where it is hard to say so. For instance, militarily speaking, the US still has a very, powerful, big military, and its military spending is still well above not only any other country, but even though large areas of the world. I think that's a place where you really can't say that the US is a superpower in decadence. Economically, it's still the largest economy, although compared with the world GDP, the US proportion of the world GDP is smaller every year. In addition to that, its growth rhythm, it's becoming, it's not picking up the slack, particularly in regards to China. Politically, it is still, an hegemonic power around which the current international order was organized. Nevertheless, Trump pretends to neglect it when not attacking it directly. And in terms of diplomacy and culture, what is now called soft power, the US is still, a country with a tremendous capacity of influence. Nevertheless, again, the terms of that influence are being, weakened, whether it is because of the US position about Gaza, whether it is for the disruption that Trump has caused regarding NATO, even, with the apparent dismantlement of US aid. So this is a debate that I think it's central, critical to understand what is happening. Paradoxically, Trump very explicitly said that with the beginning of his second presidency, the U.S. starts a new golden era in which he was going to rescue the U.S. from its decadence. But at the same time, his very presidency and a lot of his policies are susceptible of being understood as a symptom of that decadence. They express it or they even accelerate it. We got used to the US for many decades as a sort of global sheriff or, the policeman of the world. And I think nowadays it is very clear that the US had the force, but it also tried to cultivate the authority with many buts and ifs and all the caveats that you want. And I know immediately I can think of many myself. But there was a certain attempt to cover, that force with a certain screen of acceptability. Call it, if you want, the civilizational value of hypocrisy, But that hegemony was not only sheer and brute force. There was something else, incomplete, defective, deceptive, but there was something else. And nowadays, what we see is something different. I think Trump's America is not the America of the global sheriff or the world police. It is more an America turned into a bandit, or into a troublemaker of the world. And it is particularly troubling to wrap your mind around that, to see Trump playing the victim card when the US has been and still is the hegemonic superpower of the world. Now, turning a bit to Mexico, what does that mean for Mexico? I mean, we all know that the post-war position of Mexico, and later on during the 1990s on, was, Mexico was aligned with the United States. Nowadays, we're hearing, voices that sound familiar, that talk about the need for Mexico to diversify. And well, if you look back in time, there was a successful attempt at diversification, particularly during the Porfiriato. There is a very good book by Roberta Lajus about the foreign policy of the Porfiriato and its successes. But after that, well into the revolution, or particularly the post-revolutionary period, and after the Second World War, I think there have been certain efforts, relatively isolated, interesting, audacious, but, in the face of which the insertion of Mexico within the North American orbit has been and still is a fact. It feels sometimes as if it was, a force of nature, a geographic destiny, or whatever you want to call it. No? And well, of course, with the 1990s and then the North American project in NAFTA, it was clear that Mexico was no longer going to fight against that destiny, but to embrace it, to make it work, and to make it render, all of its potential goods. And I think that was the case, and that had a tremendous impact in Mexico, not only in commercial or economic terms, but politically, culturally, socially. Mexico really embarked on a well-defined direction to become part, openly and explicitly, willingly, of the North American, not only the North American project that was NAFTA, but I would say the North American geopolitical region. Nowadays, in contrast with that continuity, what we're living is very disruptive. In both cases, in the post-revolutionary period and in the post-1980s period, or the neoliberal period, if you want to call it that, the priority of the US has always been Mexico's stability. It was not that important if Mexico was not a democracy. The US had a margin to live with the fact that Mexico was not a country where there was an actual rule of law, respect for human rights, a lot of the things that played a certain role rhetorically. The US was willing, to look to the other side or, negotiate with that. But stability was the number one priority of the US in both of those periods. And nowadays with Trump, it seems the very thing that he's worried about the least. I would argue that Trump is actually trying to destabilize Mexico, or at least he's not concerned by the destabilizing impact of his policies, of his very attacks, rhetorical attacks on Mexico. This might take us a bit to talk about the place of Mexico in the U.S. and how it has changed during the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. There's always been an anti-Mexican sentiment, part of the xenophobic tradition in the US. There's always been an anti-immigrant feeling. There's always been, people, certain social currents that were against, commercial integration. I still remember, Rose Perot and this image of the sucking sound that he used to talk about when NAFTA was going to be approved. And nowadays, very few people remember. But Rose Perot, was perhaps the most successful third candidate since, the 1960s or 1970s. He was really representative of certain currents, in the American political system, in American society, in American culture, very antagonistic towards Mexico. There always been, these figures, Lou Dobbs. I don't know, a lot of people that even in the best years of the bilateral, post NAFTA relationship, there were always those voices, and that sort of a disagreement with that project, but they were minoritary. They were more or less fringe voices. But since Trump came well, first as a presidential candidate and then as president, something changed there. Not only those fringe voices became mainstream and actually inhabited the White House, something that hadn't happened for a really long time. But it was also the fact that with that came a shift in terms of the place of Mexico in American politics, particularly in American electoral politics. And I think Mexico became a piñata in that sense. Mexico became a screen upon which, a lot of fears, a lot of anxieties, a lot of grievances were projected. And I think it was very successful. I don't think Mexico has represented the most important threat that the US has faced ever. But it became, not only a piñata, and I'm going to mix my metaphors here. I think it was a low-hanging piñata. And that politically made it a very effective tool in terms of electoral politics, whether it is the promise of massive deportations, whether it was the promise of building a wall, in the first Trump presidency in particular, or whether it was, the promise of reviewing and the threat of, disappearing NAFTA. All of that it really worked politically. It was a way for Trump to connect with voters that felt left behind, that felt that America was changing in a way in which there was no place for them, playing with Obama's motto. America was in a path of a change they couldn't believe in, so to speak. And I still remember in 2012, I'm sure some of you remember, the Republican Party made this sort of post-mortem when they lost with Obama the second time around. And there was this document that was called the Growth and Opportunity Project, in which was the very GOP was very critical of the fact that they were becoming a party that was positioning itself against the very changes that American society was going through, particularly demographic changes. There was this sense that democracy and demography were pointing in the same direction, that the US was changing, and that the Republican Party needed to update itself, update its positions, because it was clearly seen, according to them, and maybe they were still, under the beating of the Obama coalition, There was this sense that otherwise they would become a minority party, a party of old people, a party of the places that were less dynamic culturally or economically. And then 4 years later comes Trump. And Trump sort of proves them wrong, partially because he doesn't win the popular vote, but well, he still wins the presidency because of this very peculiar institution that is the Electoral College. And then Trump loses in 2020, but then in 2024, he wins, and he wins strongly, not only in terms of the majorities he wins in the House and the Senate, but also in terms of the popular vote. He wins by a slim margin if you look at it historically, but still, he has the democratic legitimacy of having won a majority of the popular vote. And what this means for Mexico, in terms of what I was talking about, of its place in American politics, is that now, Trump's threats against Mexico are not necessarily something that, it's just Trump, it's a Trump peculiarity. Donald Trump can claim that he has a mandate in terms of acting, in terms of massive deportations, in terms of, increasing border control, in terms of security, of fighting fentanyl, or even, launching operations in Mexican territory unilaterally against criminal organizations, in terms of, putting commercial integration to the test again and threatening with tariffs. All of these things are not now only Trump's agenda or the Republican agenda, but could be argued that they have a popular mandate. And I think this is important once we move to talk about the impact of all of this in Mexico. Because for a long time in Mexico, we have said, or when I haven't, but a lot of people have said, worry not, this is only, kabuki theater. Trump is a lot of talk and not a lot of action. He's not going to do this, particularly in terms of deportations or in terms of tariffs, because it would imply shooting himself on the foot, so to speak. The cost that, America would pay if they deported millions and millions of people, and the impact that would have in terms of, certain industries, construction, food, agriculture, that would rise price ups, that would wreak havoc, and that's not going to happen. I think it's a valid argument. I think it makes sense in many ways. But I think that, as an old French philosopher, Pascal used to say, truth is not the opposite of error. Error is the forgetting of the opposite truth. And I think there's another argument to be made contrary to that, in which Trump has been preparing the terrain for these policies. And I think it is still very believable that he will, implement it. He will carry on with them. I will talk about this last episode at the end. Because, he won the second time around, explicitly promising that. So even if this generates an economic, a social, or a political cost, not carrying on, not fulfilling those promises will also carry another cost. Yes, Trump cannot re-elect himself again, at least, at the moment I'm having this talk with you. And that might be important in terms of he's dealing with the political cost. There is, of course, a trade-off here. You have to pay a cost if you don't do the things you said you were going to do and the things that people voted for you. Yes, there's also a cost in doing them. A cost that very people might end up paying as well. So, it is complex. It is not simple, but I don't think we can just wish it away by assuming that he's gonna go with, not trying to pay the cost that doing the things he promised would imply. I think he has built a certain, not only a discord, but a certain social expectation about that somehow is gonna, play out against the cost of doing it. And moving on now, as I said, to Mexico. In the beginning, in the 1990s, North American integration felt a bit like the European Union, as a project in search of a reality, as Bulgarian intellectual Ivan Krastev has put it. And nowadays, North America, maybe as well as Europe, seems more like a reality in search of a project. On the one hand, I think NAFTA reached its limit in terms of the goods that it could deliver. It really changed the face of the Mexican economy, particularly in certain sectors and in certain regions of Central and North Mexico. And in industries like, well, agribusiness or, cars or certain, computers, screens, refrigerator, electrodomestics, a lot of those things are made in Mexico now. But when China entered the World Trade Organization, that promise or that potential, really found a strong break. And the funny thing is that if you look at the growth rate of Mexico since the beginning of the 2000s until now, it has been very mediocre compared with what the potential that NAFTA was supposed to bring. I assume that in the selling of NAFTA, and Nexos has produced a very interesting podcast. You might want to not take a look, but to hear, called "The Invention of North America." It might have been that the promise of NAFTA was oversold in the 1990s. It might have been inevitable to do so, but it is still interesting if you look at other Latin American countries that didn't have this advantage or this privilege or whatever you want to call it, and it doesn't seem that NAFTA really pushed the Mexican economy as a whole in terms of growth took it to the place where it was supposed to take it. A lot of people say, well, imagine what would have happened without NAFTA, or others say, well, you have to look at this, regionally, or more, specifically. Certain regions of Mexico have experienced very important growth rates during these decades. Others haven't, and that's what evens out. I mean, there's a very large debate about this. But there was also the feeling, and you guys should ask Ildefonso Guajardo about this. I had the opportunity to talk with him some months ago. And when I told him this sense that, NAFTA went from being a project in search of a reality to a reality in search of a project, he was telling me that, yeah, that he felt that at some point in the first decade of the 21st century, and in the 2000s, some steam was lost, and that NAFTA became the status quo. And somehow, both countries, or the three countries, did not really try to update it to see what else could be done. It just became something that, yeah, we have that now. And for instance, nowadays, one of the things that another one of the people that Emilio invited for this seminar, Eduardo Guerrero, has been talking a lot about the possibility of having something like a North American security agreement, like a NAFTA for security. And I'm not going to dwell into that. I'm sure he will when he talks to you. But this might be, in a way, a symptom of the fact and how novel and original and strange this idea sounds, might be a symptom of the fact that NAFTA just became the status quo, something that we had, and it wasn't really taken advantage of by any of the countries involved. At any rate, the impact of Trump's second presidency in Mexico, we're in the process of finding out what it will be. But so far, we know there are, very direct and severe threats in terms of deportations, in terms of tariffs, and in terms of operations against criminal organizations in Mexican territory, unilateral military, perhaps, operations against Mexican cartels. Although it must be said that those operations have already started. They might not have been armed, they might not have been violent, but there was clearly a covert operation to take El Mayito, el Chapo, el Chapito Guzman and El Mayo Zambada, the two leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, to take them to U.S. soil, arrest them, and negotiate with them. I mean, this happened, and Trump was not even president. So this might actually be a signal that the bilateral relationship is going through a dark moment, was going through a dark moment even before Trump won. I remember I wrote a piece for Letras Libres some months ago talking about how, there was this feeling or this hope in Mexico that if Kamala Harris wins, it's going to be a picnic for Mexico. I didn't think that was going to happen, even if Kamala won, and certainly not if Trump won. Mexico is being put, I think, or has been put, with Trump, but even perhaps a bit before, on a passive, purely reactive position regarding what the US does. I think there's been this sort of disalignment of priorities between both countries. And from the Mexican perspective, it seems that, our aim, our objective, or our purpose is merely to defend ourselves, not to get or not to ask for anything in return, at least in terms of the bilateral relationship, because in terms of domestic politics, I think the scenario is a bit different. A lot has been said lately in Mexico about the possibility of what's called a rally around the flag effect for Claudia Sheinbaum. I think the Obradorista coalition has been deliberately trying to push that to happen, or at least the perception of a rally effect happening. I think the private sector has collaborated with that. President Sheinbaum tweeted one or 2 days ago a video, with a collection of communiques or desplegados, as we call them in Mexico, from a lot, from a lot of groups in the private sector supporting her. Yet, I am skeptical about the possibility of a rally around the flag effect actually happening, because Claudia Sheinbaum is already a very popular president. I mean, the quintessential example of a rally around the flag effect in the US is 9/11 and what it did to Bush's popularity. Bush was around, I think, 50% of approval. And at some point, 1 or 2 weeks after 9/11, he reached 90%. And a year and a half or 2 years later, it was still 60, 65%. So it was not only very, very steep, but very long, that rally around the flag effect. I don't think there's much room for Claudia Sheinbaum to grow in terms of her approval, quite frankly. And, she already has a very comfortable majority, in the House, in the Senate, in terms of governorship. The Obradorista coalition controls 3 of every 4 governorships nowadays in Mexico, something that the opposition during the transition years never did. I mean, they achieved in less than 10 years what the opposition couldn't in 20 or 25. So I think the Obradorista coalition is already very powerful, in terms of political power, in terms of public opinion, in terms even of the private sector, willing to work with them. So what would that rally around the flag effect mean? What my reading of it is that, it's interesting to think about it in terms of the Obradorista coalition. And that's what I would put my emphasis here. I think that, the tension with Donald Trump creates certain spaces of opportunity, of possibility, of tensions within the coalition. Because, well, we know that, Morena becoming such an hegemonic force politically, territorially in Mexico did not happen because it was part of the Obradorista project to fight against organized crime. In many ways, it happened because, they were willing to capitalize discontent and anger with the traditional political class, the transition parties, with violence, with lack of economic growth, with inequality, with a lot of things. But we also know that at least part of Morena's hegemony was built because they cannibalized, parts of the political class that were willing to be cannibalized by Obradorismo, particularly from the PRI. It has become like the holy grail of Mexican politics. The PRI is the most hated party in Mexico. But priistas become morenistas, and suddenly, they become electorally competitive again. So the Obradorista hegemony was built not upon an actual rejection of the old political class and not a rejection of the old facts that the old political class had with organized crime, but by a cannibalizing of it. And now Trump puts Sheinbaum in a very difficult position because after the López Obrador sexenio, where there was a clear political or policy of appeasement with criminal organizations, like a poorly learned lesson from Calderonismo, where Calderon really took it to the streets and took the army out to give a frontal combat to criminal organizations, and that, created a lot of violence. Sometimes it seems to me that the lesson that López Obrador and his coalition learned from that is that, open full frontal combat does not work or creates a violence that then becomes more costly. So I think they opted for an appeasing policy that had an effect in terms of homicides. Homicides stopped growing. They are now, more or less stable, although disappearances went through the roof. But now I have not heard Claudia Sheinbaum repeat once this idea of abrazos no balazos. And the person that Claudia Sheinbaum has appointed to become the security czar in Mexico is clearly somebody who is not in agreement with that policy. Mexico Evalúa just published a report a couple of weeks ago contrasting, the number of operatives, the number of people detained, the number of, I don't know how to say the word in English, decomisos, of drugs in Mexico that have happened since Claudia Sheinbaum is president, and you can see a radical change compared with López Obrador. So on the one hand, Claudia Sheinbaum seems to want to change the security policy, even though, she came to power with the promise of continuity. There are many things that you can tell that she wants to do something different, but that she can't say it. There's a lot of rhetorical creativity here because she talks about the second floor of the transformation of continuing the great work of President López Obrador. But here and there, you start to find signals that she's doing things differently, or that she's introducing differences that cannot speak their name, because this would imply, even if it's just, not openly, but they would imply a criticism of the things that López Obrador did that need changing. At the same time, Claudia Sheinbaum has been so far very supportive of governors of Morena, particularly in the state of Sinaloa, that have, that everybody knows have had a relationship, a very close relationship with drug cartels. In Sinaloa, Rocha is unpresentable. His popularity has tanked. Even the Department of Justice, La Fiscalía, has hinted that that Rocha had something to do with the killing of Héctor Melesio Cuen, his most important opponent in local politics, and with the operation that ended up with Chapito and Mayo in the U.S. Even the Federal Justice Department has hinted at that. Rocha, there are interviews, when he was a candidate, where Rocha said openly that he thought that, politicians needed to negotiate and have an agreement with organized crime organizations, hinting at this idea of the Pax Narca, or the appeasement policy that I was talking about. So Claudia Sheinbaum has these two things. On the one hand, she has Harfush. On the other hand, she has Rocha. These two figures, might end up representing the security dilemma created by Trump for Sheinbaum, that she has to choose. Or it might not, since that assumes that the US is really interested in the security situation in Mexico, and not only on how it impacts its own population, particularly regarding fentanyl. There has been a certain expectation amongst opposition circles in Mexico that Trump might end up becoming a sort of opposition force, or the ultimate check on the Obradorista powers coalition, because all other internal oppositions and checks have been debilitated or defeated. Yet I think that expectation, speaks, it sounds very desperate, and it speaks of the bad spot the opposition is in Mexico right now. It's a very defective reading of Trump, because Trump is not going to be the last resource champion of Mexican democracy, because he is a force of democratic backsliding in the US and in the rest of the world. Yet it's interesting to think about how Claudia Sheinbaum might actually use the pressure created by Trump, to make certain decisions or power moves within her coalition. If you read La Jornada nowadays, or you listen to some of the voices, the most propagandist voices, Obradorista voices in the media, they sort of respect Claudia Sheinbaum, but at the same time push for policies or positions that are not exactly in line with what she's saying. These are, more what the opposition would call Castro Chavista voices, right? So it's interesting to think how Trump's presence or Trump's threat might end up playing within that coalition. For instance, López Obrador was very critical and very aggressive against civil society organizations in Mexico. And now with Trump's policy, to cancel USAID, those are the ones that survived the Obradorista sexenio are in a critical condition if they don't receive funding from USAID. So let me end saying something about this last episode of this weekend's episode. I think that, from a certain point of view, both parties, both Mexico and the US, Claudia Sheinbaum and Trump, win because of the optics. They can both claim that they won something. Trump can claim that he won the 10,000 soldiers Mexico is going to put in the border. Claudia can claim that she won time for the tariffs not to come into effect. At the same time, there are a lot of bad things. Starters, the time question. This is supposed to go on for 1 month. What is going to happen after that month? We are clearly under evaluation. We have put ourselves, or we have been put in a position where we have to accept that the US is going to evaluate our results. Claudia Sheinbaum talked a lot about how the US needed to assume its responsibility regarding the security situation in Mexico and the power of cartels because of the selling and the trafficking of arms from the US to Mexico for those organizations. She said that the US committed to work on that. Trump didn't say anything. What is Mexico's position regarding deportations? Something was published by the Washington Post saying that as part of the negotiations, Sheinbaum accepted to put in place remain in Mexico again. The operatives, a lot of things have not been said. It is perfectly feasible that what we have learned, or the public terms of the negotiation, are just the tip of the iceberg, and that a lot of things, as happened the first time when Trump and López Obrador negotiated, are there. And probably the ugly part is the White House accusation that the Mexican government was, in cahoots or complicit with organized crime organization and providing them protection. This is a historical truth. I wrote this today in my op-ed. This is a historical truth that in the mouth of a foreign country constitutes a diplomatic offense. So Mexico won time, yes, but this is barely starting. Trump is deliberately disruptive and unpredictable. And I think that, we should take stock of the fact that the only thing certain today is the empire of uncertainty. Mexico's, project for the future in the 1990s has taken a new turn. And now, it happens that we are married with an aggressor. What are we supposed to do now and how? I don't think, I think nobody has an answer, that we're still shocked by the very fact of the question, but this is where we are now. I will end here, and I'm eager to hear your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. You certainly have given us a lot to talk about. We have a little time for questions and comments. If you would raise your hand in the Zoom application, I will call on you. I think I have Bob Kendrick. Oh, no, you were just clapping. Okay, well, raise your hand in the Zoom application, and while you think about what you want to ask, Carlos, I have a question slash comment. I mean, if 35 years ago, when this process of NAFTA started, you had told anyone there or here that 35 years later, the American right would be bent on destroying that process of integration, and the Mexican left, such as it is now in the 21st century, would be fighting fiercely to defend it. I mean, it seems completely unimaginable at that point. So my question is, back then the lefts in plural had a lot of disagreements with NAFTA. They had a lot of concerns about North American integration. There were a lot of alternatives, real or imagined, but they were there. I mean, is that all gone? In other words, I mean, is Mexico now, whoever governs Mexico, on one path that is, unchangeable, and because it has restructured itself to really be an appendage of the larger American economy, or are there other possibilities? I mean, it seems that if there aren't, then Sheinbaum's government is saying that it is willing to cooperate on security. It is willing to cooperate on migration because it needs to do everything that it needs to do in order to ensure that this economic arrangement, which would shatter Mexico if it was severely disrupted, is kept in place. And whatever cost it has to pay, will. It is, again, from a historical perspective, remarkable because, the left was always wary in a lot of interesting ways that echo the present, with what it might mean to go fully on this path of North American integration. What do you think?
Well, as I was hearing your question, I was reminded of an episode that happened in Chicago. I think it was in 2004. I was there. You were there when as part of a seminar a bit like this, but it had certainly a much higher profile. That NAFTA 10 years after, and you remember we had Carlos Salinas come to Chicago and give a talk, and we also had like a smaller gathering with him where we could ask him questions. And the impression I got in 2004 was that there were a lot of criticisms, but that nobody really considered the possibility of an alternative path. NAFTA had won sort of that cultural victory. Even when I remember that as part of that cycle, you invited Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas to come. And even Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas had some suggestions on how to reform NAFTA or how to make it larger. But nobody was in the business of saying that NAFTA should be gone. It seemed like, as Margaret Thatcher used to say, there was no alternative, right? There were criticisms, but nobody even imagined. This was like the loss of the PRI in the 1970s. It was not even imaginable. As you say, it's quite a shock where we are now, where the American right was actually it was Bush father with whom Salinas negotiated, and Republican support was guaranteed. It was the problem was the Democrats, the unions, and all of that has changed. At the same time, NAFTA remains, and it remains even after the first Trump presidency. So as I said, I think NAFTA today is a reality, but that maybe has within the US not a lot of champions. And in Mexico, I think it has become the status quo to a point where I don't think there are some very fringe voices that are saying, let's go with China, as if it was a matter of will and just a choice you can make as what shoes you wear that day. It's very difficult, and the integration of our economies, it's a fact of life that we have to deal with. And I think that there might be in the making a certain current saying, okay, so what do we do now that we're married to this aggressor and that NAFTA is in question, as Europeans are with NATO. Some voices in Europe are saying, we need to build a European army. We can't rely on the US anymore. But I think it will take a lot of time, and that Trump is going to be watched very closely in terms of what he does. But because if he uses tariffs like he did this past weekend, and in the end he ends up conceding for very marginal things, quite frankly, with Canada and with Mexico. So some are saying Mexico and Canada promised to do what they are already doing, and Trump caved. If that is the case, I think that current of thought that you're hinting at will not develop.
Interesting. Any questions? Well, while people gather the courage, follow up on that. There was a third speaker in that series, you remembered, who was Armando Bartra.
Yes.
Who is now close to the government, and in a much more powerful position, relatively speaking, to what he was then, was an outright opponent of NAFTA. And there were arguments about food security, about Mexican agriculture, and so on and so forth, that sort of were presented as being, challenges to the costs that NAFTA and North American integration would bring, and so the question is that something now? I mean, in other words, there's the China idea, as you say, as a kind of like, well, as if you could, but it's there. But is there some sense that the vulnerabilities that have been revealed about the Mexican economy, deep ones in all kinds of sectors, which are the product of this integration, whether there was a path or not, is there any thinking about how this could also be a lesson about how to at least mitigate them, not undo them anymore, but so that when this happens next, if they survive this, when Mexico is in a less vulnerable position, or is it really now a matter, as you said, of a marriage that's consummated, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to sort out the disputes in the least painful way?
Well, I mean, I remember Bartra as well, and I think he was the most critical. I don't recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall him saying we should do away with NAFTA. He was very critical of its social costs, particularly as other people that asked questions during the whole seminar. But I think that even Bartra, in a certain way, accepted NAFTA as a fact of life back then. And it still feels like that today. I think it's also, and I keep coming back to Europe because I think it's an interesting mirror upon which to reflect and to see ourselves. Europe is in very dark, low hours, after Brexit. But even far-right parties right now in Europe are revising their anti-European positions because they have realized that, if Trump, carries on with his threats against NATO, Europe as a union needs to coordinate and do something. So, pulling out of Europe might be very costly for some countries. So but there's still, I think there's a lot of proven error, so to speak. They're trying. They're watching very closely as what happens. I think it's the same in Mexico. I totally agree with you that the vulnerabilities have been exhibited to an extent that they were not exhibited before, not only because of the social costs that we already knew about in 2004 or in the 2010s, but in terms of the larger, economic and political vulnerabilities that this creates. But on the one hand, for instance, Mexico has created, without any sort of pressure of push from the United States, another vulnerability itself, which is the judicial reform. And in the US itself, Democrats are sort of accepting that, or Republicans as well, accepting that, the era of free trade is gone. There is a neo-protectionism wave riding all across the world. But the question is still, what kind of protectionism are we talking about? Because even if it's formulated in very nationalistic terms, I think the fact of the matter is that the only protectionism viable in today's world is a regional protectionism, a protectionism a la europea, so to speak. European countries have free trade between them, but they're very protectionist to the outside. I think, for instance, that the idea of the Plan Mexico that Claudia Sheinbaum put forward a couple of weeks ago is, the best possible version of it. It's an argument to tell the US, okay, do you want to go protectionist? Let's go, but let's make it regional and not national protectionism. So I do think there is this sense of trying to revise, or to continue with the metaphor that the couple is going to therapy, because there's still a lot of ideas and possibilities to save the house, even if some of the furniture is gone.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. I have one last one then. So if this process of economic integration is either inevitable or, clearly, irreversible, or the best outcome, under the circumstances. I mean, it was often thought back then that there was also a very complex and fractious process of demographic integration that would also help along down the road. I mean, the fact that the growth of the Mexican population in the United States, it's growing slowly and irregularly, but participation in American politics, not just Mexicans, but Latinos more broadly, that would sort of over time erode some of these distinctions. But in the last election, I wanted to ask you about that. But also, and the troubling fact that in the last election, I mean, forget Latinos, the number of Mexican Americans who voted for Trump went up significantly. And sort of what to think of that idea that, somehow what governments won't do, people will, if you give them enough time, and that in that was ultimately the real meaning of this integration. That was also a demographic one.
Mm-hmm. I think that the demographic question is fundamental, not only in the bilateral relation, but all over the world. I mean, because demographic patterns have certain very alarming trends in many cases. But I'm not going to talk. I just want to say that I think this is a subject that is going to fall upon us in the next years and decades. It is one of another. It is another one of those issues that are very surprising to look today at that. You were saying, the growth of the Latino population was at the heart of the notion that the Republican Party had to update its positions, because Latinos were thought of as other minorities in the US to be predominantly Democrats. And now in this election, it is the least the pro-democratic Party minority in the US. What happened? I think that on the other hand, you cannot, I mean, this is a lesson, or as we would say in Spanish, una cucharada de sopita de humildad. You cannot assume that demographic trends imply in and of themselves political trends, because, the political preferences of populations might change. And I think this is what we saw in this last election. And I also think, for instance, that, people used to think that, since white rural America was bound to become a minority, they were bound to become politically irrelevant. Not the case at all. Politics is still a sphere of relative autonomy. And that, in spite of all the structural determinants and the large long-term dynamics, there's still novelty that can happen. And I think, nowadays in Mexico, we're thinking about, well, so what is the future? What is our bet for the future since it didn't work? I don't think we have answers, and I don't think we will have them for a long time, because I don't think we still understand all the things that have happened and that put us in this incredibly, uncanny position of looking around, looking at the past and saying, how come this happened? How come things, turned around? And this is not only in Mexico. I think this is happening all over the world, also in Europe and in Asia. The world has changed so much, so fast, and so profoundly that we're barely grasping on the causes, not the consequences, on the causes and the meaning of that change.
Thank you, Carlos. We are nearly out of time. I want to use a few seconds to invite all of you to join us again next week at the same time when our guest speaker will be Eduardo Guerrero. And as Carlos said, we'll concentrate on matters of security. He's a very prominent figure in those discussions in Mexico and beyond. So I hope many of you can join us. And now, to close, all that I have left is to thank Carlos Bravo Regidor for his thoughtful remarks and discussion. I'm sure we'll have him back often, as this process that is so unclear and unpredictable continues to unfold. So thank you, Carlos, very much. And thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon. And I hope to see you all next week. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.